Hi, my name is Maurice Jones, and I'm so excited to have you with us. I am the President and CEO of LISC, and welcome to the 2020 Congressional Black Caucus Annual Legislative Conference. I am going to moderate or try to moderate a panel that is on the issue of justice reinvestment, emptying our prisons to fund our communities. We're going to discuss a handful of things today with a focus on three areas: exploring the alternatives to prison and identifying ways that states and localities can begin to shift money away from incarceration. That's one. Two, learning about new scholarship related to strategies for defunding prisons and opportunities and challenges associated with local reform in the safety and justice arena. And finally, discussing reentry programs and community investment approaches that seek to heal our communities damaged by mass incarceration that has occurred over a number of years. I'm so delighted that our host and our organizer for this panel is Congressman Bobby Scott, my congressman. I'm so delighted to be with him and others. I'm going to introduce them all for you, and then we'll roll from there. Let me start with Congressman Bobby Scott. As I mentioned, Congressman Scott is my congressman. He has been Virginia's 3rd Congressional District Congressman since 1993. Prior to that, Congressman Scott, or Bobby as we all know him, served in Virginia's General Assembly for 15 years. You will see there's a bio of him, and I won't tell you everything, but he has a distinguished career in public service. He also lives in Newport News, Virginia. He's a graduate of Harvard College and Boston Law School, or Boston College Law School. He served in the Massachusetts National Guard in the United States Army Reserve, and most especially for this discussion, he has been a tireless and faithful champion and fighter for justice and equality and racial justice in particular. And we're so delighted to be with him. And Congressman Scott, I'm going to turn it to you to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Maurice, and thank Board US for sponsoring. Thank our panelists, and of course our audience for participating. We have an exciting issue to discuss today. It's called Justice Reinvestment, or how we can better use the money that we spend to put less in prisons that aren't reducing crime and more into strengthening our communities where we can reduce crime and actually save money. When it comes to crime policy, we have a choice. We can reduce crime or we can play politics. We can reduce crime by following the evidence, by focusing on prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation. We can play politics and codify simple-minded slogans and sound bites: 3 strikes and you're out, mandatory minimums, abolish parole, or you can get it to rhyme: if you do the adult crime, you do the adult time. As a freshman congressman in 1993 and 94, I led the opposition to the 94 crime bill. That thing was full of all the slogans and sound bites. It had mandatory minimums, it abolished parole, 3 strikes and you're out, 60 new death penalties, tried juveniles younger and younger. That bill followed decades of tough on crime slogans, beginning with the war on drugs in the 1970s. All that got us was mass incarceration. 5% of the world's population, 20% of the prisoners. Experts tell us that any incarceration rate over 350 to 500 per 100,000, but 350 to 500 per 100,000, anything much more than that is actually counterproductive because it's having no effect on crime. You've got too many people with felony records can't find jobs. You've got too many parents trying to raise children from prison, and you're using too much of the Department of Justice budget on prisons that aren't doing anything when that money could have been used effectively for something else. Instead of 350 to 500 per 100,000, over that counterproductive, United States incarceration rate, 700, about 700 per 100,000. And some states lock up blacks at the rate of 4,000 per 100,000. So just do the math. In a community of 100,000, locking up blacks at the rate of 4,000 per 100,000, that means that small city is spending between 50 and $100 million on counterproductive incarceration. So that money could be better spent, and that's what this panel is all about. So Maurice, I appreciate your participation, and I want you to call on our panelists so they can tell us how we can spend the taxpayers' money more effectively to reduce crime and actually save money. So thank you very much and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate all your great work and appreciate your pulling together this panel. Let me try now to briefly introduce our 5 panelists. I'm going to introduce them all right now, and then we will hear from each one of them separately. I'm only going to give you highlights of their bios. You can get their full bios on the CBC website. And so please look at that and you'll see just how distinguished this group is. Plus, they're going to wow you with all their remarks today. Let me start with our first panelist is Professor Douglas A. Blackman. Professor Blackman is a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, scholar, teacher, and filmmaker. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Slavery by Another Name, the re-enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II, which is what won the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction in 2009. Professor Blackman is professor of practice in Georgia State University's Creative Media Industries Institute. He's also done a bevy of other things that I will hold off on now, but that you can read. But suffice it to say, and he's still a young man, but a very, very impressive bio. Next, we have Nicole Porter. Nicole is Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project. The Sentencing Project state and local advocacy efforts on sentencing reform, voting rights, and eliminating racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Her advocacy has supported criminal justice reforms in several states, including Kentucky, Missouri, and California. Ms. Porter was named a new civil rights leader by Essence magazine for her work to eliminate mass incarceration, among other things. Next, we have Professor David Ball, who is professor of law at Santa Clara School of Law. He works primarily in the field of criminal justice, writing and teaching in the areas of criminal law, criminal procedure, sentencing, and corrections. He's had law review articles in places like Columbia, Yale, Stanford. We got to get the University of Virginia in there, but I'm sure we will. But it's all good. It's all good. So Professor Ball, we're delighted to have you with us as well. Next, we have Leah Sakala. Sakala. I got it right. Leah Sakala. My apologies. She's Senior Policy Associate at the Urban Institute, where she co-leads a team focused on criminal and juvenile justice reform. Her work has included collaborating with policymakers and advocacy organizations to advance reform discussions, evaluating the impacts of criminal and juvenile justice policy change, and supporting strategies to build effective community-based systems for safety, for healing, and for accountability, amongst other things. And finally, but certainly not last, we have our friend Bobby Kipper, who is the Executive Director, Founder, and Senior Advisor for the National Center for Prevention of Community Violence. Bobby actually began his career with the Newport News Police Department in 1977. Now, he was 12 in 1977, so just remember that. But during his 26-year career, he served in the areas of patrol, investigations, media relations, and as executive assistant to the chief of police. Following that service, he served with Virginia's gang reduction program at the Office of the Attorney General, and he's founder, as I said, of the National Center for the Prevention of Community Violence. So a really, really impressive panel. We're so grateful to have you all. We're looking forward to hearing your insights. Their complete biographies are available on the virtual CBC ALC website, so please take a look. Before we hear from our panelists, we do want to take a moment and acknowledge Forward US. It is the generous sponsor for today's panel. Let's take a listen to what Forward US has to say.
It's all around just hard. I remember the day I got home and my mom told me he was going back to prison. It's hard on a family living from phone call to phone call, visit to visit, paycheck to paycheck, year after year. So let's stop arguing and start fixing.
Terrific. That's great. So let's start with Professor Blackman now. I am going to try to be a gentle but firm moderator. Professor Blackman, you got no more than 6 minutes. Go for it.
Thank you. I'll stick to the time. I won't be the preacher's kid that I was born to be, and go on and on. But thank you all for having me. It's terrific to be part of a panel like this with other great panelists. Important discussion, important organization. So it's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to the staff for bringing me in and Congressman Scott. But I think the best contribution for me to make here is to talk mostly about history, because that's what I've done the most scholarship on and looked at the hardest. And the history as it relates to the current day criminal justice system is all bad, as far as the treatment of African Americans. And the most important part of that to understand in terms of the history is that the criminal justice system was never really designed to be a system of justice for African Americans. In fact, it originally wasn't designed to involve African Americans much at all, because in the old days of slavery before the Civil War, African Americans weren't considered citizens. They weren't considered to be subject to the laws in the same way that that other people were, and because they were considered to be the possessions of slave owners, unlike any of that terminology, but lack of a better word, they were considered to be under the control and the punishment and the setting of rules of those people. And so after the Civil War, when that system of slavery finally came to an end, the criminal justice system suddenly had 4 million formerly enslaved people who now had to be brought into the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. And almost all of the ways in which the justice system changed over the next 100 years were done in ways that were designed not to give justice to formerly enslaved people or their descendants, but to deprive them of justice. And the justice system was used over and over and over again, both to make money for the government, the selling of the labor of imprisoned people was the single biggest source of income for many, many state and local governments for many, many decades. Huge source of revenue over a long period of time. But even more importantly, the criminal justice system was being used to suppress Black citizenship. And the way that was done was by passing laws. All of the southern states passed laws, and there were a lot of very similar laws in the rest of the country, because this was not a purely southern phenomenon. But all the southern states passed laws that explicitly made it a crime, essentially, to be Black, where the legislatures of the South took behaviors and patterns and just cultural practices of people, like things like walking beside a railroad line to get into town because the road was so bad. Those were things that were made criminal specifically because those then became easy avenues for the arresting of African Americans and then forcing them into the sale of their own labor for the benefit of the state, for the benefit of powerful white people. And so all of that was the resurrection of slavery that I wrote about in the book, and also the film that we made for PBS, also called Slavery by Another Name. And that's also where the 13th Amendment comes in. When I first wrote about this more than 10 years ago, people were shocked to hear that there was an exception in the 13th Amendment. So the amendment abolishes slavery as we commonly understand it, but it includes this exception that allows for slavery in the case of punishment for a crime. Now, it's supposed to be people who are duly convicted of a crime and who actually did commit a crime, and a real crime at that. But it's through that exception in the law that allowed for this resurrection of a new form of involuntary servitude that looked a whole lot like the old system of involuntary servitude that had occurred before the Civil War. And so it was the resurrection of that old system, the use of it to both raise money for the state and to make people kind of addicted to that revenue. That's part of it, but also as a way of suppressing Black citizenship, pushing African Americans away from exercising their right to vote over and over and over again. The first people arrested under these laws and forced back into labor were local leaders, African American leaders, people who were trying to organize other African Americans to resist what was happening to them at the end of the 19th century. But so these laws raised money, suppressed citizenship, and generally terrorized African Americans. This was something that was an even more ubiquitous element of Black life in the rural South than mob violence and lynchings and the things that we know better and understand better. But instead, this was this hammer, this sword that was hanging over the head of every African-American family in the rural South, for sure, all the way up to the beginnings of World War II, and in some respects, long beyond that. But so that's the history that sets up the modern criminal justice system. And then finally, the debates that began to try to make it a more just system for all people, beginning in the 1960s, but a struggle that obviously we're still trying to get to the end of and try to make effective.
Professor, thank you for that. I mean, it just it just highlights the point that this fight for full citizenship for everyone was in the DNA of America from day one, and we're still fighting that fight. So thank you very much for highlighting that for us. Let me ask then next if Nicole Porter will give us her perspective on this topic. Nicole.
Thank you. So I am Nicole Porter with the Sentencing Project. We're a research and advocacy organization based in DC. I'm going to share a few statistics with you and research findings, but we know as a research organization that behind each number and statistic is a person who's been directly impacted by the criminal justice system. And behind the data sets, we work with our communities and neighborhoods that have been disappeared and forever changed because of the policies related to mass incarceration. I was grateful to hear from Professor Blackman. I'm so grateful to be on this panel with the other speakers. And starting with history is important. My contribution today will be to pull from some of the research that the Sentencing Project has published over the years that directly highlights and uncovers some of the practical efforts that lawmakers and stakeholders are engaging in to reduce the scale of incarceration and imprisonment and shift resources into prevention-based strategies that hopefully reduce contact with the criminal legal system altogether. There's been several changes, although the scale of incarceration is still high, and the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, but there have been changes in recent years. Over the last few years, there have been at least 44 states that have reduced their prison populations. But I'm going to pull specifically from a report that we published in 2018 titled Decarceration Strategies, How 5 States Achieve Substantial Prison Population Reductions. In that report, 5 states, Connecticut, Michigan, Mississippi, Rhode Island, and South Carolina are highlighted. The changes that were highlighted in the report provide an overview of a cumulative total of more than 23,000 fewer people in prison with no adverse impact on public safety as a result of reforms, some of which were technical, others of which have helped to shift and recalibrate those states' criminal justice system overall. The report highlights 5 key strategies, including leadership to initiate and sustain justice reforms, reductions in prison admissions via declines in new commitments to prison, decreased prison admissions via technical violation, reductions of technical violations on probation and parole, and increased prison releases by increasing efficiency of release, as well as increased prison releases by decreasing time served before release. So these 5 key strategies and practices have helped reduce prison populations in the 5 states highlighted in this 2018 report, under the first key strategy, the measure to get justice reforms underway through leadership, high-profile leadership, bipartisan leadership, and interbranch collaboration within all 5 states helped to launch justice reinvestment initiatives with the goal of reducing those states' prison populations. That leadership was also supported by community engagement with reentry-led organizations, many organizations that were led by directly impacted individuals themselves, that helped to provide community support for prison population reductions. And it was very critical to ensuring that those prison population reductions could be enacted, but also sustained over the years since being adopted. Other strategies include decreased prison admissions via technical violations for community supervision, and also through sentencing reform to reducing new commitments. These reforms have been critical because they focused on reducing admissions for prison-bound defendants. So not expanding probation for people who might have been sentenced to probation anyway, but intentionally focusing on reducing admissions for prison-bound defendants through sentencing reform. So there are crime reduction efforts in all 5 states through prevention. There is also the recalibration of technical violations on probation and parole that took prison off the table for many people who might be on probation or parole for many years and technically violated by missing a meeting with their parole officer or not complying with some issue. There are other changes in these 5 states that help to reduce prison populations, including increasing prison releases by reducing time served, again, through expanding in-prison programming and allowing the reduction of time served through good time credits or earned time credits. So these changes have helped to decrease the number of people in prison and help to reduce the overall prison populations for the 5 states highlighted. Individuals who are interested in learning more, because I was only able to touch on key highlights given our need to hear from other panelists this afternoon, can find this report online at sentencingproject.org, where we go into greater detail around the technical aspects of what states did to intentionally reduce their prison population. And the resources achieved by reprioritizing strategies towards prison population reduction helped states to avoid costs related to criminal legal system processes that were then freed up for other parts of prevention and criminal legal practices, including public safety. Those resources have been allowed to support reentry programs and initiatives in the community, always helping to reduce the number of new commitments to prison. And so I'll wrap up my comments there and look forward to the engagement with the other panelists during the discussion. Thank you again for having me.
Terrific. Thank you, Nicole. That's an impressive array of statistics, and it's good to know that we actually have states that other states can learn from and emulate that are displaying some best practices in this area. So thank you very much for that body of work. Let me ask Professor Ball to speak next.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here. And I'm going to talk about the biggest problem with the way most states currently fund public safety. They don't. What they fund are particular policies that are supposed to address public safety, such as state prisons. And we think of this as funding public safety because we assume that prisons are a necessary and effective response to crime. The problem is that we don't have good evidence to support those assumptions. So in my brief time then, I'm going to talk about 3 things, all of which come from my article called Defunding State Prisons. I've already mentioned the first 2. Prisons are a policy choice about how to deal with public safety, and states subsidize prisons without evidence that they do, in fact, improve public safety. Based on those 2 points, I'll get to my third point, a proposal that we start funding public safety itself, not just particular policy responses to public safety, such as prison. I propose that we take money we currently spend on criminal justice and disperse it in the form of public safety block grants on the basis of local governments' reported rates of violent crime. Localities could choose to spend this money on prisons, but they could also choose to spend some or all of this money on youth programs, parks, community development, and other policies that improve community cohesion and reduce crime without the harms of prisons. So, my first point, prisons are a policy choice. In prior research, I looked at 10 years of data from California and found that the rate of prison usage in the state varied dramatically from county to county, but that these variations were not due to variations in rates of violent crime. Prison usage, in other words, is not determined by crime. It's determined by local decisions about how to respond to crime. Some counties with low crime rates send high numbers of people to prison, and some counties choose to deal with crime through other means. And this doesn't take place as a formal policy, but via local officials using their discretion. Local officials make almost all law enforcement decisions, whether to investigate and what to investigate, whether to prosecute someone and what to prosecute them for. Some crimes that might be dismissed in one part of the state get the maximum in another part of the state. What do states do to stop localities from overusing prison? Mostly nothing. This is my second point. State governments not only provide unlimited access to prison, they subsidize it, but they don't subsidize other policy responses to crime. Prison is effectively free to localities, a phenomenon known as the correctional free lunch. So while states pay for prisons, local governments have to pay for alternatives to prison, such as jail, drug treatment, and probation. Is it any wonder then that our prison populations are so large? Now, if prison were in fact the best policy we had to deal with crime, it might make sense to subsidize it. But there's no evidence to support that. We usually don't even bother to ask whether prisons work, much less collect data on it. So here's my third point. If prison is just a means to the ultimate goal of public safety, let's explicitly fund public safety itself. Let's take the money we currently spend on prisons, give it to local governments, and let them use that money to pay for the public safety policies of their choice, including, but not limited to, prison usage. When I say improve public safety, what do I mean? I think we could start by dispersing funds on the basis of reported rates of violent crime, but that's just a starting point. We as a society need to be clear on how we define public safety, who the public is, and what safety means. To me, the public includes everyone, including communities who are heavily policed, and safety means being free from harm, including free from the harms of the state. There is no public safety when analysts predict that 1 in 1,000 Black men will be killed by police. Police violence, by definition, is incompatible with public safety. Others may and probably do disagree, but if we don't agree on what public safety even is, how can we insist on funding only certain approaches to it, like prison? So this lack of societal consensus strengthens the case for the public safety block grants proposal. Give budgetary power to the localities and let them invest in what they think will promote public safety. Let's direct funding formulas away from criminal justice system usage and towards public safety need. In my view, localities could use block grants for social programs designed to prevent crime in the first place, or restorative justice programs, or violence interrupter programs, or on trauma-informed mental health care. They could, of course, also use prisons as before, but the difference would be that localities would absorb the cost of prison beds out of their own budgets. They would have to do the math to ensure prison was a wise long-term use of their resources. I picked violent crime as the funding benchmark because it's a reasonable measure of criminal justice need. Most of us care about people being harmed. Of course, we could add other elements to a funding formula, such as poverty level, educational attainment, population under 18, et cetera, in the belief that such factors contribute to public safety needs or to account for local resource deficits. But this too would be an improvement over the current system, which fails to adjust funding based on those factors. So finally, what besides prisons might improve public safety? One answer is investment in local community nonprofits. Patrick Sharkey at NYU estimates that for every 10 community nonprofits per 100,000 people, the murder rate drops 9% and the violent crime rate drops 6%. Communities, if given the resources, can heal themselves. Community cohesion, social contacts, and even green space reduce crime and also improve public health, which to me is also part of public safety. It's not an oxymoron to talk about public safety and also talk about moving away from mass incarceration. Completely overhauling criminal justice funding is a bold idea, and it may strike some of you as risky. But our system now is already a global and historical outlier. We incarcerate more people in this country today than any other society at any point in human history. Isn't that the risk? Is it more likely that everyone else who ever lived is wrong, or that we are? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Really appreciate that. Also really appreciate that framing of what public safety actually is and what goes into it. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Let me ask our next panelist, Leah Sakala, to give us her take on the subject of today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be part of this panel and taking part in this really important discussion. So as Mr. Jones mentioned at the beginning, my research focuses on reducing mass incarceration and correctional control and building up community-based strategies for safety and healing. And so this question of moving and reallocating resources is at the heart of both of these tasks and essential for shifting the center of gravity for how we do safety in the United States. I'm so pleased that we started with the historical context because I think grounding there is key to understand why we need a change, and specifically naming that the communities that have been the most policed, surveilled, and incarcerated have also experienced consistent and systematic underinvestment, just as Mr. Bala just mentioned, in really the resources and infrastructure that keep them safe and healthy. And this has particularly impacted Black, Indigenous, and Latino communities in the United States. And so now we're at a moment where we have an opportunity, and I would argue a responsibility, to really use all of the tools that we have at our disposal to repair the associated harm. And one of the best and most exciting parts of doing this work to me in the research space is really learning about how communities around the country are already doing this work of repairing this harm and have been doing so for a long time. And we have a lot to learn from the way that they're innovating to connect public resources with community safety work that lies entirely outside the criminal justice system. And so for this discussion today, I thought it might be helpful to name three major policy strategies that we've seen to move public resources into communities in service of safety. So the first one, as the name of this session implies, is this concept of reinvestment, or enacting justice reforms like the ones that Nicole mentioned at the beginning, to harvest savings and reinvest them in community infrastructure. And in addition to the places that she mentioned, states like Oregon and Louisiana recently have used this approach via reform legislation. But I would also add to this conversation that we think about, or suggest that we think about all of the resources that have gone into mass incarceration and think about how we can repurpose them. And that includes things like physical resources. So for example, the dramatic decline in youth incarceration means that now a lot of communities have empty facilities that can be repurposed as Apache County in Arizona did to turn a juvenile detention center into a community teen center, and similar work is going on in Texas and elsewhere. So in addition to reinvestment, the second approach is a more straightforward invest-divest approach, which requires moving dollars directly from the justice system into community solutions. And invest-divest has been a central demand of many of the organizers in the national uprising against police violence as a core need moving forward. And the third approach is just creating new streams of public investment, which includes everything from channeling federal funding in strategic ways to doing what the city of Oakland did and just creating a brand new parcel tax and parking surcharge that went into a pot that now supports violence interruption and youth violence interruption work in an ongoing and sustained way. And so what we're seeing from the work of these communities and many others is that they're leveraging and combining these strategies in ways that really build and sort of have a cumulative effect to move the ball forward to investing in community solutions. One example that I like to name that I think particularly illustrates that is the story in Colorado, which has really been a leader in this space of community investment. Beginning in 2014, when they passed legislation to create the Work and Gain Education and Employment Skills Program, which created a funding stream to support local organizations, many of which are led by people with direct experience in the criminal justice system, to provide reentry services. And the success of this program led to a subsequent grant program called Transforming Safety, which allocates $4 million every year, split across two very specific communities that have been hardest hit by mass incarceration and over-policing. And local planning teams made up by residents and community members get together and decide how they're going to use that money in service of public safety. And I think these examples really show what can happen when real dollars are invested deeply in communities to support them in supporting one another. Now, one thing I'd like to just name is that I'm not referring to investment in a purely transactional sense of governments granting dollars to organizations to provide services, although that's certainly part of it. I'm referring to investment in creating an infrastructure for safety that really supports not only direct service provision, but also collaboration and scaling and really building and supporting grassroots leadership so that this work can evolve and grow over time. And so I think as these examples show, every level of government has a role to play in moving this work forward. I've mentioned a couple of examples on the state and local level, but we have a new paper that's just coming out with a proposal for how this might look from a federal funding stream to more directly support this work going on around the country. And so just to conclude, we're at an incredibly challenging and unique moment in history with kind of unprecedented level of engagement in this question of what safety is and how we build it and how we fund it. And by following the lead of communities that have been engaged in this work, we can really chart a new path together forward. So I'm so excited about this conversation, and thank you all for being here.
Leah, thank you. I really appreciate that, those insights and those stories about communities and how the community is a essential piece of public safety, and we've got to leverage community assets. So thank you for that. Let me now turn to Bobby Kipper to give us his take on our subject. Bobby, welcome.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the CBC and also my good friend Bobby Scott, who I've been with for many, many years, not only talking about this, but trying to design, impact in this area. And we've been able to experience impact in a lot of ways. We're not there yet, but I'd like to share today some things that we do see having impact on. I'm glad that the professor talked about community level public safety. I happen to be a big fan and a proponent of that. My organization really looks at the process of violence as well as the process of exactly what we're talking about here today. Violence is a process, it's not an event, and so is violent crime, as well as mass incarceration. Ladies and gentlemen, we didn't get here overnight. And this has been a process for a long, long time that's been delivered here today, but it does fall in so many ways to community leadership at the community level. Just exactly what Professor said, how do we choose to police? How do we choose to really bring a holistic approach to prevention and intervention within our communities? Without that, we are totally lost. And that's exactly what happens in a lot of communities today. The first thing I would say about community investment and reinvesting in these issues today would be we have to admit our failures. And for many communities, we've not done that. We've not been in a position where we looked at what does not work. We circle the wagons. We focus on things over and over again. We put our same funding into the same organizational structures and things within communities. And many of those things have not been tested to work. The issue that we deal with today is really finding that unique strategy for each community. And I want to make sure that we understand the difference between strategy and programming at the community level. Strategy is basically a planned process to eliminate or to set a goal. A program is just a part of that process. So without an overall community strategy, and my good friend Congressman Scott knows exactly where I'm going with that, because he's been the #1 proponent from that from day one, all the way from the Youth Promise Act to reforming our justice system, to everything that he's championed through the years. But it's absolutely on target. We can prove that with the application of what we've done at the community level. One of the things that I've had the opportunity to do, and really has been, formative for me, not only in my police career, but actually past my police career when I became the director of Virginia's Gang Reduction Program. We started a program that's based on an acronym that I call PEER, and it was actually a GRIP project, which the Congressman is well aware of. We saw double digits reduction in violent crime in the city of Richmond by community application to a strategy and a process. And we basically moved that through 44 community partners. We have to get away from the high level of thinking that government is going to solve this issue. It's going to be solved by community partnership and those on the ground that are actually doing the work. That is where our reinvestment has to start. It has to start at the community level. I want to share just a couple of words about our acronym, which is PEER, and I want to start with P. P starts for prevention. The reason prevention doesn't work in the United States is because it's like Baskin Robbins. It depends on what month it is as to what program you're pushing. We have to be strategic about our prevention efforts, and we have to stay the course. for so long, we basically have looked at something and we spend a little bit of time at it. And if it is not making holistic changes, wholesale changes, then we basically throw it out. Consistency and prevention has never been a part of community planning. It must be a part, it must be sustained at the community level, and we must know exactly what we're getting when we put our prevention funding into place, that we're coming out with results. There are a couple of things that I think each community needs to do. First of all, they need to fund what works, but they also need to fund what is sustainable at the community level. And what brings results for community prevention is very important. The second thing that we need to do is we need to look at, our I in our acronym, which is intervention. First of all, prevention. Second of all, intervention. We have to look at our early situation when we look at early delinquency within our system. We fail to do that. We fail to use the statistics that we get at the local level, including status offenses from juveniles, people that are on the Rolodex of juvenile court appearances time and time again. We let this continue to happen at the community level without a solid intervention program to really reaching out, trying to save these individuals before they go to a situation to become incarcerated for a lengthy sentence. And one of the things that I would say is that our intervention strategies and our prevention strategies cannot just be for our youth. We have an issue of young adult Americans here between the ages of 18 to 25, which needs an extension of that prevention and intervention strategy at the community level. These people, many times from all walks of life, exhibit a clear pathway to lengthy incarceration with intervention efforts such as drug courts and other things that have proven successful, need to be sustained and need to be provided at the local level. Next is enforcement, because the bottom line is, as the professor talked about public safety, we only look at public safety from the issue of enforcement. One of the things that we established in our gang program was that we went past looking at gang enforcement. We have focused on gang issues in America for a long, long time. And I wrote about this in my first published book called No Colors, 100 Ways to Keep Gangs from Taking Away Our Communities. And in that book, we talk about the failure of communities to look at the issue of gangs. We look at gangs as strictly an enforcement issue. We must focus on gang reduction at the local level. Without doing that, then again, we miss our mark. And it's very, very important. The other thing I want to be clear on is too many of our law enforcement agencies within our communities, and I can speak, obviously, the gospel of that because that's where I came from. We basically, a lot of people are just looking at the numbers. Our arrests and our application of public safety should not be based on numbers. It should be based on community strategies to reduce the issues within a community. Within the last few years, we went back to a program called ComStat, which is based on numbers. But once again, taking policing, I believe, in the wrong direction. Police reform will start with a strategy to look at whenever we have to enforce the law, we need to do it on a strategic approach to what makes the community safe, as the professor talked about today. And last but not least, the R in our acronym stands for reentry. I've said this a lot when I speak nationally about these issues, but one of the things I say, to let someone out of incarceration to go back to a community without a community life plan is like washing clothes without detergent. We have got to do things within our system to improve. In Richmond, Virginia, for instance, what we did was before people got out of local incarceration, we gave them the opportunity, which was sustained and paid for through public funding, to get their GED. People were getting out of local incarceration, providing job interviews, job applications. We were actually taking tattoos off gang members so they could be employed. What I would like to say in finishing up my comments today is that the interesting thing that Congressman Scott and I have always had in common is that we know what works. The problem is we know what works, but we fail to invest in it. We fail to invest in these strategies at the community level to really, really make a difference. And I hope when we look at police reform or we look at reforming the justice system, that we can take these core issues. One last example I will give you from our Richmond project.
And I want you got to do it fast because I want to do one question for a lightning round.
Okay, very quick.
We got 5 minutes left.
Somebody said to me, why did you invest in healthcare at the local level within the Richmond project, because many people were not able to go to doctors. So we took a triage van of doctors and nurses and took it into the most violent communities. I want to end this by saying there was no question in my mind that citizens actually believed in their value again, and they came out of their apartments, they came out of the issues where they were in fear, and they took their community back. Once again, thank you all for having me today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Bobby. Appreciate it. Appreciate all those examples and your vast experience. 5 minutes. We got to do one question lightning round of responses, if you will. So I had a handful of questions. I'm just going to pick one. Here it is. So today we actually discussed, a number of you discussed, we've got a history of mass incarceration in this country and racial disparity when it comes to incarceration and imprisonment, et cetera. The question is, what one step, if you could only urge one step, should the federal government and states and localities take to address this issue? One step from the public sector, and what one step from the private sector should the private sector take? Actually, I'm going to start with you, Bobby.
Well, thank you.
The other Bobby, the Congressman.
Okay, I'm sorry, Bobby. Who'd you call on?
You, Congressman Bobby Scott.
Well, thank you. I just want to thank the panel for all of their important testimony and the importance of looking at evidence. We've heard the history, but we've also shown how we can use our money a lot better. Texas did this. They were looking at a $2 billion appropriation for future for the future projection of prison space. $2 billion. They spent $200 million on prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation, reduced crime so much they didn't need to build any prisons, and close some they had. And so we can do a lot better than we're doing, wasting money on counterproductive incarceration, and need to be doing a lot of what we're doing today.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Bobby. Leah, one thing the private sector can do, or one thing the public sector can do, but just one. We got 3 minutes.
I'll go for the public sector, and I would just say reckoning and repair, and in the form of tangible and sustained and deep investments that follow the leads of what communities need.
Terrific. Professor Ball.
So I would say in England, they have what's known as a golden key, where people can go in and inspect prisons and jails without any advance notice. I think that's one thing that the public sector can do. And one thing that private citizens can do is go to local budgetary hearings where you talk about funding police and law enforcement and contracts, and really get all in that. It's so important, and nobody goes.
Great. Mr. Blackman.
What I would say is that in terms of the public sector, it's less a specific policy move, but a sensibility. This is also a way that we can support police officers in a way that has become difficult, support them in doing a better job and a safer job. And that is to stop expecting that it's going to be law enforcement and police officers as the final arbiter of whose conduct is allowed in this society and who's not. And the idea that death at the hands of a police officer is an acceptable outcome without any kind of judicial system process or adjudication. We've got to get away from this idea that police officers who are supposed to clean up everything for the rest of us when we fail to fund schools and fail to fund health and all of these other community-based efforts, which we've heard all this evidence of today, make a huge, huge difference. We got to take that burden off the cops.
Terrific. Nicole.
Okay, I'll be quick. One thing is adopt racial impact statements, which is a policy proposal similar to environmental and fiscal impact statements. Lawmakers, legislatures can adopt this to intentionally look at what the potential racial impact of proposed sentencing laws might be, and the private sector can support them, can show up to those hearings and share with their lawmakers why they support such policies.
Terrific. Bobby Kipper, one thing the public or the private sector can do here.
The public sector can really invest in strategic and strategies and not just programs. Privately, I think that people need to really believe in the second chance. Employers need to step up to the table and interview people and give them the opportunity that all of us would need to move forward.
Fabulous. From a list perspective, we think if you want safety and you want justice, it's not the absence of something, it's the presence of something. Good housing, good jobs, good health care. And so what we are trying to do is get the public and the private sector collaboratively to invest in these things, particularly in Black and brown communities and low wealth communities. We've invested about $22 billion. We've leveraged about $65 billion. We need to have much more massive investment in the things that we know, the determinants of health, the determinants of justice, the determinants of safety, and we know it can be done. I want to thank the Congressman. I want to thank the CBC. I want to thank these distinguished panelists. It was terrific to be with you all, quite insightful. And I hope that those listening to this will take this invitation to work on these issues that we've all talked about so we can have a more just and a more fair America. And so thanks to everybody. Have a good day. Stay healthy. Stay well.